Hello everyone, and welcome back to Money Power Health with me, Nason Mani. As we've discussed in previous episodes, we often tend to think of our health as the product of our own energies, something we alone are accountable for. But in reality, our health is to a large degree shaped by the conditions we find ourselves in, the quality of our air, the wealth of our parents, our opportunities for work, our time for exercise. Schools and education are a key part of this, a key driver of health. Schools shape how we see the world and interact with each other at a critical stage in development. Most people might assume that schools are a place in which commercial influence is largely absent. That, however, is far from the case. Children are a key market, and brand loyalties formed in childhood can persist into adulthood. Standards of behaviour, of consumption, taste, and definitions of coolness, risk, and fun are all being formed during this critical time. In part due to this, there is now a long history of manufacturers of unhealthy products funding the development of lessons plans, initiatives, and activities in primary and high schools that involve issues like fossil fuels, firearms, alcohol, gambling, or smoking. These activities have significant strategic value, and in order to understand more about why and what it means for children and young people, I'm very pleased to be joined by someone who has led on several studies examining the nature and purpose of such funded materials in schools. Dr. May van Schalkwyk is a research fellow in the Commercial Determinants of Health, based both at the Global Health Policy Unit here with me in Edinburgh and at the Centre for Pesticide Suicide Prevention, also at the University of Edinburgh. She serves as an honorary public health consultant with Public Health Scotland and an honorary research fellow at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she completed her PhD in 2023. May originally trained as a clinical doctor and then specialised in public health medicine. Her research aims to explain how commercial actors influence ideas, knowledge, science, and policymaking. As part of this, she's published research on tobacco, alcohol, gambling, fossil fuels, opioids, pesticides, and firearm industries, including on the influence of youth education and safety programs as a form of corporate political activity. Full disclosure, May and I are good friends and go back some time, having met at LSHTM and worked together for over 7 years now, researching the commercial determinants of health, including some of the articles we will be discussing. I'm very grateful to her for offering her time for this and hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. May, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nathan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Oh, no, the pleasure is mine. I'm really excited to speak about your journey, your work, and like the topic of this episode in particular, schools. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask a little bit about your journey because I think it has been quite a journey. Could you tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in commercial determinants of health?
Of course. I mean, I have to say I'm a bit excited too by this. One thing I do want to say is also it's wonderful to contribute to, I think, the journey of your podcast, if I may say. I've valued learning so much from everyone else who you've spoken to. So it really is an honor to be able to contribute and come along on this journey with you and others. Yeah, how did I get into the commercial determinants of health? I was actually reflecting on this before we started and thinking about actually what Rebecca Cassidy said about her journey and how varied it's been and really just being open to taking opportunities as they came along or reflecting on things that you experience as you go along. I can't say I knew from the outset that I was also interested in research, and I would never, ever claim to have even thought about or even known about commercial determinants. I think I've mentioned to you before, Nathan, that even when I finished a postgraduate medical degree, I don't think I really comprehended what even the word policy was. I do have to confess, I think I've always had quite a sense of adventure. I think growing up on a farm does that. And I've always asked why. I think to the annoyance of potentially everyone around me, quite a lot is asking why. So I think I've always been asking questions. So I originally started as a biomedical scientist, I think like yourself, and then realised I really valued and felt honoured to help people a lot more closely to the ground. And I love talking with people, which is probably what makes a podcast good, because I talk a lot. And then I entered into postgraduate medicine. I had the honour of doing that at Sydney University, and have always loved clinical medicine. And I had the honour of working in the Red Cross Children's Hospital in South Africa, seeing, very different lives, very different experiences, and then started doing clinical medicine in the UK when we moved here. And I had a really unusual time quite early in my career as a medical doctor, in that I also did some cancer research on very advanced, extremely advanced T-cell based therapies. So I worked in HIV medicine and then returned to oncology to then actually be delivering a therapy that I had helped develop as a researcher.
Wow.
Which was an incredible experience. And I thought, I know exactly what I want to do. I want to work in oncology. And I was very interested, particularly in lung oncology and mesothelioma. These are areas where really the survival rate was terrible when I was working, and really quite a devastating disease. And it was really at that point that these two things actually kind of led me down an extremely different path, which was, one, I was developing these extraordinary cell therapies which had so much promise for treatment, though. And I kind of thought, but wait a minute, where's the greatest burden? And will these treatments ever really, there's so much potential, and it's not to undermine that research at all, but, it just makes you think, will this ever be accessible to the millions who are affected by things like what we were doing with head and neck cancer at the time? And then similarly with the mesothelioma and lung cancer, I had the most amazing, patients, so strong and incredible. And they used to say things like, it's great you're treating me, but how are you going to stop this from happening to others? And and that story of how affected they were young and they didn't know. And then I was like, well, how did all this happen, and why does it continue to happen? And how is it that, despite so much science and evidence, so many people were harmed? And really, I'm sorry, this is a very long-winded story, but
no, this is fantastic.
That's where I actually started to read about, what's the history of this? And I think I was saying to you when we started the podcast, I in preparation, I brought out my Oxford Handbook of Medicine, because I started to, dig around in these. I mean, we've got extraordinary number of pages and words, and it really is a thick book with little writing. But, there was lots about smoking being the leading cause of some of the most devastating diseases, and mesothelioma being attributed to asbestos. But it stopped there, and I needed to know more. And so that's where I really started to read the story of these incredible industries that have been at the heart of some of the most, devastating public health problems we've had in the last century. And that continues to happen to this day. And then I really have to say that it was people like yourself and Mark Pettigrew and Anna Gilmore and Martin McKee. And I started reading about all this work, looking into industry and how it undermines science and policy. And I have to confess, I thought this is real public health and medicine for me. And it's where I think that needed so much more attention and impact. So I'll end by kind of saying with my story, though, is sometimes people ask, but don't you miss clinical medicine? And I'd like to say that I'm so honoured to be working in the field of commercial determinants, but there's not a day that goes by that I don't miss clinical medicine, because it is such an honour and such an incredible role to play. But I think you kind of realise that I personally feel there's nothing I could do more than for my patients, than for people, than this area of research. So I hope that makes sense. How I ended up where I am. I can't claim to have planned very much, but definitely a journey of passion, that's for sure.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Wow, what what a journey! All in service of, I guess, the same patients that you were meeting in those early days, and a journey emphasizing the value of prevention, I guess, over treatment. I'd actually never heard you say that, so thank you very much for sharing that with me. And then I guess that led to your general interest in commercial determinants. But I wanted to ask about how you came to choose your PhD, and maybe from that we could lead into how you first became interested in industry activity in schools.
Sure. No, thanks, Nathan. So, I mean, I was quite daunted when I first entered into what we would call now the commercial determinants. I remember even when we first met, we were deciding what we could call it, and is it corporate, commercial, and I think we're now even still kind of exploring different concepts and ways of understanding how industry actors influence public health. So I, as I said, I found it quite daunting to kind of think about, how can I contribute? Because I didn't just want to reproduce, and there already seems so much research, but understanding where we could add more understanding and insight. So I actually started with some work on the tobacco and then alcohol industry. Had the honour of working with you and Mark Pettigrew and others in that area. But what I wanted to do was kind of understand new areas that we could explore that potentially haven't had as much research and examination as other areas, such as influence on science, for example. But even there's still much more to understand. And also other industries that potentially have received not as much attention, either because of the funding streams that are available, but also how, the pathway between a product and harm isn't so clear, or works through different mechanisms. And so in particular for my PhD, I focused very much on, the area was UK gambling industry and UK gambling policy. I've had incredible support from Rebecca Cassidy, who spoke previously on your podcast. And then alongside that was a real focus on trying to understand other ways and mechanisms through which industry influences health and kind of norms and values in relation to their products and the regulatory environments in which they work. So my focus on schools in particular, I followed some work I did on taxes. I know that sounds like an odd leap, but in understanding how tobacco taxation works, a lot of that is about stopping youth uptake. And then that's where I also started to understand the efforts of industry to target not just policymakers or researchers, but particular their focus on youth. And then from that, shaping norms and values and understandings, and the work with you and Mark on kind of industry-funded education charities as well. So that's how I started in those areas.
Wow, I'm super excited to dig into this, because I think it's an area that is both not really a sufficient focus in research, or even I think in advocacy, although I think maybe that's starting to change. But it's also something that I think viscerally seems wrong. Like the idea that commercial influence starts very early in childhood in environments like schools, which we think of as being precious and to be protected, like that kind of early introduction into a wider social world. So I guess it would perhaps help if you could paint us a picture of what you mean when you talk about industry influence in schools, both historically and then perhaps leading into empiric work you've done on how industry influence permeates through school environments.
No, thank you, Nathan, because I think your kind of description of it and your lead into it is perfect, because I think one of, if you kind of articulated in what you were saying, is that also that particularly this kind of time of youth and the context of education, it really does deserve so much more attention. And I think kind of coming back to Public Health 101 is education is, one of the key social determinants of health, and that really, the quality of your education determines your trajectory, and that everyone has the right to a quality education. And so I think it's, that kind of foundation is a good place to start. It's key to everything that we do in a way. It's the same as having, a safe home and good quality diet. So I think one of the things that is really important to grasp, and it's exactly what you've captured there, Nathan, is that as an issue or a topic, I was actually, when I started looking into it, and with some fantastic support from yourself and Mark Pettiger and others, when I started looking into this in relation to alcohol industry activities in schools, is what really struck me actually is when you start to scratch the surface is how many elements and aspects you actually have to think about and take into consideration when you start to characterize industry influence in schools as a public health issue. And so I think it's worth, we can take some time to kind of go through that, because I think there was some kind of key things that really struck me was that the history of this, this isn't the last, 15, 20 years, and it hasn't just emerged, around the time of more recognition of harms from industry. And so I think taking that into consideration is key. The other is the pervasiveness. So this is a global issue, and it's a multi-industry one. You're pretty hard pressed to think about an industry, particularly those whose products are highly regulated or should be harmful to health and the environment, and how many of them actually have quite extensive and well-resourced programs. And the other is to think about the different ways in which this is working to kind of undermine public health or contrast with goals around youth health. So there's lots of different things to unpack. And I think in particular, another thing to reflect on is that while you and I and others have done some more research on this, and we were doing some more, and there is more to understand and to study, but we do have quite a decent amount of evidence of why industry is doing this, and that they continue to do so. So I think it's not just looking for more evidence, looking for more examples to research. It's stepping back and saying, why are we not taking note and acting on the evidence we do have? We can come back to that maybe on reflections for researchers at the end, is that there's always this tension of more versus what are we doing with what we have. So I think, importantly, there's some really, really well done research by tobacco scholars who look at internal industry documents to understand, for example, why the tobacco industry engaged in youth smoking prevention programs. But just starting with your first point, Nathan, about the history. I mean, I think we could do a course on this. So, and I don't want to bore your listeners who are very kindly giving us their time in listening. But I do think it's important to understand how far back it goes. So, for example, we know that even the lead industry was very early to start giving out colouring books and other activities in schools, and it does it dates back decades. I think some of the more comprehensive research is on these kind of activities in the US, so that's possibly where I'm going to be drawing most of the examples. And I think that's important to recognise in and of itself, is that there are many contexts where we probably have very little understanding of the extent of these activities. But I think what's important to realise is that it goes, well beyond kind of efforts to market a particular product. So we tend to focus on that, and there's been a lot of great work, as there should be, to kind of curb advertising of unhealthy food or kind of pointing out that this is just promoting fossil fuels or lead or tobacco. but actually some of the more historical analyses by great researchers, for example, at King's here in London, show that there's also been this very long-standing recognition of the need to shape curricula that promotes certain understandings of the role of government, of business, of worldviews. And so it's a lot more about shaping ideas and norms and values at a very kind of key time in a young person's life. And, from the fossil fuel industry has been doing this since the 1940s, for example, and promoting understandings of the essential nature of fossil fuels is a really, really interesting story and dates back to, as I say, about the 1940s and onwards. And we can see that at particular times in which an industry starts to become, that their reputation starts to become threatened, or the science starts to emerge that their products are becoming harmful, they often then not only engage in very elaborate and well-studied efforts to shape science and policy, but alongside is this kind of flow of effort and I suppose, as you would say, pollution of discourse that flows into schools, and really trying to promote an understanding that's favourable to industry interests, and this influences curricula around the world, as we've been saying. But there's not the other examples are, milk industry, sugar industry, the food industry, and most recently our work, which is on the alcohol and the gambling industry, and how this influence occurs. But I'll let you ask if there's a question you'd like me to unpack on some of these issues a bit further.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find really interesting about delving into this is what I thought was obvious and problematic versus what is really deeply problematic and sort of hiding in plain sight. So I thought it might be useful to listeners to kind of give some examples to help paint a picture of what this kind of influence looks like in terms of specific campaigns or initiatives, the kind of narratives that you mentioned, like maybe some examples of those narratives in relation to some of those industries. And perhaps that'll help give us a sense of how embedded some of these are, but also, I guess, how insidious some of them are.
I think what can be helpful is to break this down into kind of three channels or three aspects that is important to consider. And one is the role of some of these programs and the promotion of youth education as a policy measure. So if we start at that kind of policy level, is to think about how a lot of the activities of industries will be around adopting these measures to ward off regulation that they don't want to happen, or to block or delay regulation unfavorable to their industry. But we must remember those very same policies are often those that are key to protecting children and young people from their activities and products. So there's that direct conflict. So you see this policy substitution where don't regulate us, don't restrict advertising, don't worry, we'll handle everything by providing education in schools. And that has this knee-jerk kind of reaction of brilliant. We always think, we always welcome education, and I think, and that's completely understandable. But it's understanding that often it's not complementary. It's often a direct replacement to what we know is really needed to protect children and young people. So that's a kind of a higher level, policy role here. And I'm going to read out a conclusion from one of the tobacco industry analyses that I think really captures all this. But just to then introduce, then the next is to think about then the other part of it is to kind of burnish or promote an industry as a socially responsive community, as showing an interest in protecting children and young people and helping to deal with very important public health issues. But at the same time, it is kind of building legitimacy for an industry that might otherwise be undermining science, undermining policy. And so actually acting in a way that's completely counter to to showing care and interest in youth and young people and children in particular. And also continuing to market in certain ways or harming the planet and actually undermining the future generations in that way. So you have this building of legitimacy, you have policy substitution. And then the next element, which I think is then the content. But I think it's important to understand that there are those three aspects to this, because if you then just kind of look at, superficially at the content and say, well, it's not so much a big deal, you miss the other ways in which these programs are acting as or contributing to that wider commercial determinant of health kind of story of how all this is happening. And before we get into the content, I do just want to read this because this is a really important conclusion from I think a very important study. And as we were talking about before, is that issue around these kind of analyses have been published. This was published in 2002. This is a fantastic analysis by Ladman et al. Published in the American Journal of Public Health. But so they really looked across decades of the tobacco industry's efforts to promote their youth education programs, predominantly in the US, but all over the world. And they concluded, based on looking at internal documents, that the purpose of the industry's youth smoking prevention programs is not to reduce youth smoking, but rather to serve the industry's political needs by preventing effective tobacco control legislation, marginalizing public health advocates, preserving the industry's access to youths, creating allies within policy-making and regulatory bodies, diffusing opposition from parents and educators, bolstering industry credibility, and preserving the industry's influence with policymakers. And I think that's just a really, really good summary. And you can see how we haven't even talked about what's in the programs. But what we've captured there is actually how, and I do recommend people read that analysis, because the kind of narrative from the internal industry documents explicitly shows these are, delivered for the interests of the industry. And I think the other important thing to say is very, little or no evidence they're effective. Some evidence shows it's actually, either promotes smoking or at least promotes the interest of the industry. But sometimes it's also important to realize, even if there was some benefit in receiving this type of material from an industry-funded source, you mustn't overlook then the other ways in which the industry, it might be wider issues around promoting industry access and legitimacy that ultimately, over the kind of broader picture, undermines implementing policies that we know need to protect children and young people. Then there's the content, which I think is what you were saying, and I think this is essential to appreciate as well, because often it's very much echoes or mirrors what we see in some of the ways in which industry seeks to influence kind of adult knowledge or wider public debate about an issue. And I think some of the ways in which this is subtly done, it's really important to understand, because it is harmful, and it is, I think, against the kind of public health approach, which is thinking about equity and social justice, and being able to being empowered to understand what's going on, what's harming your health. So often it is about promoting kind of personal responsibility narratives. So the harms associated with a product are all about people's misuse or abuse of a particular product, and doesn't really capture the ways in which a product has almost been designed to be addictive or highly palatable, unhealthy food. And in particular, then this blame shifting onto, well, it's you might lose control, or you misuse or abuse a product. But a part of this narrative also needs to fit into the context, which is youth. So it's all about blaming peer pressure, and blaming parents for not dealing with the peer pressure, or teachers for not dealing with the peer pressure. So there's always this deflection away from very powerful corporate actors, who are actually the ones who design the product, and marketed aggressively, and also resist any measures to anything like availability, restricting availability, accessibility, and pricing that is key to protecting children and young people. So you see that there might be kind of factual knowledge presented, but it's all about highlighting one way of knowing about the problem, while shying away from describing it in a very different way. Of course, we know peer pressure does shape children's decisions, but we need to ask why children are pressuring each other into drinking, or why it's seen as rebellious, or why gambling is everywhere, and why you might be bombarded with ads. And I think in particular, it's that kind of very one-sided story, or particular perspective that really undermines what we know is the driver of choice, and where the power lies to shape those choices. And I think a particularly important aspect of this is also to realise how it could be quite kind of corrosive of those relationships that are really key. So an independently funded program on harms from alcohol, smoking, and drugs that I looked at promoted how actually positive peer relationships are. And so actually, if the kind of industry narratives, they're undermining relationships between peers or even parents, kind of saying that these are the influences that we should be blaming. These are the kind of relationships that are the issue here, which I think sometimes gets overlooked as well. The other aspect of this is also about normalizing of the products, and I think this is as I was saying, there's the kind of brand advertising. So we know, for example, there was an episode in California a few years ago where Philip Morris, gave the book covers, and they had, I think there was obviously advertising or kind of logos of industry, and we see that with McDonald's when it goes into schools, or other types of companies that go in and promote and have their imagery on all the materials, and that kind of overt marketing. But you don't have logos and actual products to be normalizing a product in society and its use. And so I think particularly one of our and because you're one of the authors on the paper that we looked at in alcohol industry influence in schools, but for your listeners and those who aren't familiar with the work is the kind of normalization of knowing how to pour a standard drink, or different ways of producing alcohol, or different types of alcoholic drinks, and that this is the kind of thing that you would do around times of celebration or having fun. When you compare that to, if you were to look at another independent another independent education program, or even the kind of evidence around what we know is effective in teaching children about harmful products, that you don't see that kind of we need to promote different types and how whiskey's made and standard drinks. So it does kind of show you there's a slight that there are subtle but really important differences there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I find really illustrative is the consistency across different harmful product categories, and the ways in which those different levels of influence that you describe bear out. And I think, thinking, for example, of sugar sweetened beverage companies promoting physical activity programs in schools is an obvious one, where yes, you have maybe the brand presence, as a form of marketing, but more broadly, you have this implicit message that exercise is the key, and it's not really hidden behind that. It's not about our products or overconsumption of our products, or the fact that we're reliant on overconsumption of our products, and that we're actively targeting you to try and get you to consume as much of our products as possible, but that it's really all about exercise. The agency is with you. It's about you exercising more, and embedding that very early on in in childhood as, obesity being all about you and your individual actions and responsibilities rather than the consumptogenic environment, the environment that you are born into, where sugar sweetened beverages are marketed everywhere, consumed everywhere, are literally sponsoring Christmas. And I just think when you sit back and think about it, it's really striking that normalization starts at such a young age. And like you say, it serves a variety of functions. You could imagine how a company could say, look, we agree this is a problem, which is why we're funding education in schools. And that achieves, I guess, a range of goals, including policy substitution, because it takes away from regulation. But the most striking example to me is firearms, because I think the parallels are really strong, but it also really makes us stop and think about other less obvious examples, right? So the firearms industry in the US, well, firearms are the leading cause of preventable death among children in the US now. They exceed road traffic accidents. Clearly, that is very strongly linked to firearm availability, right? In terms of homicides and also in terms of accidental deaths and injuries. And to an outside observer who's not based in the US, the obvious solution would be to restrict availability of firearms, that they should be in fewer households, they should be less accessible, less readily available. But again, the firearm industry solution is school-based education, is Eddie the Eagle, is, we're part of the solution because we're teaching children what to do if they find a loaded gun in their house, on the floor, or in their parents' bedroom. We're teaching children what to do in an active shooter situation in their school. And to me, it's just the most striking example of what is actually not unique to firearms at all. It is consistent across all these areas, isn't it? That there's really a perverse logic to this, that if you get in very early to a very susceptible age group, but also an area in which almost all policymakers are in agreement that something must be done, that education is critical, you can really gum up the wheels of regulation, gum up the wheels of wider action.
You described it so well, and I think as we were speaking about earlier in the program, it's that consistency across industry and time and space. And I think in particular, we talk about industry playbook. There really is an industry youth education playbook here.
Yes.
And it's it's that understanding that it's unpicking the kind of wider issues as well, as you're talking about. Well, surely, some education is better than none. Often we're talking about, kind of under-resourced settings. But also how superficially it just sounds so promising. And I think particularly because youth and children do deserve to be empowered with knowledge of what is harmful. It's never ever to undermine that they shouldn't understand that a gun is dangerous, or that alcohol, it isn't harmful, or that gambling isn't harmful, and that these things don't exist, or that they shouldn't be aware of the harm. But I do think it's so important to question who decides, how you learn about that. But also that you can't decontextualize those harms. They need to be wrapped up in a story, don't they? They need to be framed in a certain way. That framing, that story, who's writing that, and whose interests are being, whose interests are ultimately served in these types of education programs. And I do think it's about the nuance. It's, it's not a lesson on how to tie your shoes. We are talking about some of these products are drivers of the largest public health issues in the world, and that there's some vested interests behind it. And so they do need to be taken seriously, and they do need to be seen as public health interventions. As I've often said to you and others, if we were talking about how to treat cancer, we would have much higher standards, and yet teaching children about some of, leading causes of ill health and environmental destruction doesn't seem to get the same level of scrutiny. And I think, one of the other things is understanding the kind of subtleties. So we can see kind of overt misinformation. And I think this is really important in the context of climate change. We know that there are examples of certain fossil fuel major industries still, even recently funding curricula that says a little bit of warming might be a good thing, or we're still open to debate. But then similarly, the more subtle side of things is, kind of instilling fear around what a fossil fuel free world looks like. And that's slightly different because it is challenging moving away. We are dependent on fossil fuels, but using that dependency to invoke fear of moving away from them is very different to kind of contextualizing the challenges we face in doing so. I think, the kind of classic one is these, there's Petra Pete who wakes up in the morning is petrified because all his toys and his hard hat and his tires on his bicycle are gone because we've lost petrochemicals, or the kind of spin on Clueless with Fuelless, where this horrified young woman wakes up and there's no makeup and clothes, and they all, on the surface we can laugh, but actually it's a very insidious way of instilling a kind of fear or real, I suppose it is fear, but I'm not getting the right word here, but framing it around as like this is something to be resisted, and really focusing on our dependence on fossil fuels as inevitable. And I think that's really powerful. And similarly, the more subtle aspects of, for example, we can see with gambling industry that there might be an effort, very unlike, I think, other topics like tobacco and alcohol in youth education programs, potentially where in gambling, because advertising is so overt, it's quite hard to then not kind of touch on education. But the suggestion that you as an individual need to learn how to be resistant to it or identify how you're being manipulated by it. And on the surface, you think, okay, yes, that's really great. We'll teach children to be resistant to all this advertising. That means you're asking young children to be up against some of the most highly sophisticated advertising industry actors in the world. That power imbalance is extraordinary. And I think again that it's hard to understand or identify, but I think that's absolutely key. And I think the other thing you touch on is that sometimes it's what I would say is that they've almost kind of skipped a whole rung of so many ladders to keep children safe. And the firearm industry programs are a classic here, in that, of course, if a child ever comes across a gun, what we want them to do is, we need to keep them safe as we can. But you kind of leap over the massive elephant in the room, which is, but the safest thing we can ever do for a child is to not have a firearm in the home. And so it's that classic drawing us right downstream to what you do in the event you haven't done this, and this, let's now do this, and presenting it as the kind of primary solution. And again, it also comes back to that shaping of solutions that are ultimately for the industry's interests, not those of the youth and children and young people.
No, I think you're right. And actually, there's definitely a grade of, on the dystopian scale of education programs that are normalizing school gun violence or firearm availability in the home versus normalizing physical activity as the predominant driver of population obesity rates, right? But like you say, the underlying logic is very much the same. The underlying strategic goals and the incentives driving those goals from the perspective of these companies is very similar. Something that jumps out to me that you talked about is, especially when you're dealing with primary school children, this idea that you're, on the one hand, treating them as adults with a huge amount of agency, but on the other hand, using these very emotive, childlike books and messages to appeal to these baser emotions, like not to this kind of adult logic thing, right? I just find there's something really contrasting and inherently illogical about that I find really fascinating. So on the one hand, in some of these gambling industry funded materials, and just for viewers who may not have come across these kind of programs, sometimes these are kind of packaged standalone educational resources that are presented to schools who are often, as you mentioned, under resourced, and they're saying, here's a package on alcohol, and sometimes they make very bold claims about the effectiveness. Here's an evidence based education package you can deliver as a teacher or as a school to your kids on alcohol or on gambling. Very much as with the view of education and reducing harm as part of the branding. So you have these materials, and in these gambling materials, they could say things like helping kids understand odds, helping kids understand, I guess, the nature, the mechanisms of gambling, which is very kind of both adult, but also, places this kind of huge, as you say, responsibility on kids to then figure out, is this particular gambling ad, what odds is it telling me about, and is that a good thing or not? Getting into the weeds on that. But on the other hand, you have the Petro Pete example, which are these ebooks and printed books for kids funded by the Oklahoma Energy Resources Board, which is this fossil industry fueled organization. And the books are very emotive. Like you say, they're about generating this fear that a fossil fuel free future would be an awful dystopia. It would be unthinkable. And that people who aspire to such a future are completely unrealistic and are, completely divorced from reality, from the real world, are irresponsible. And I just find these two things so interesting and in conflict, right? That on the one hand, these programs seek to place children as this protagonist that can somehow overcome all these external factors, but then also appeal to these sort of deep fears and concerns.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely it's key. I think it's also it's very reflective of what we see in commercial determinants of health more generally. Is often these conflicts, but they kind of they make perfect sense when you think about it. And often it's a kind of have your cake and eat it like logic, in that you're going to appeal to a motive, but on the other hand, you want to appeal to being evidence based. You have to the materials need to appeal to children, so they're going to be childlike or they're going to appeal to youth, but at the same time we want this narrative that actually children are completely able to make logical decisions all the time given the right information. As I'm sure you've experienced with your little ones, as I have in my pediatrics, is that children are absolutely fantastic. They want to understand the world, they're curious, they're very caring. But what they do is quite normal, and that's take risks. And I think that is particularly something where these programs are also extremely powerful, in that they go in and they teach children that these products are off limits. This is what you do if you're an adult. Now, those words are literally go over there and try it, because that's what they want to do. If you say don't try, you can't do. And what's really important is the industry, well, the tobacco industry at least, knew this and did workshops and understood that the minute you tell particularly a teenager, this is forbidden fruit, this is what you do if you want to be an adult, this is against the law, it actually inherently appeals. And I think what's extraordinary is we saw in some of the gambling industry funded materials, on the one hand, they'd say to parents, you need to be aware of what your child's doing, and would say, because children don't make rational decisions, they're emotion based. Yet on the flip side, to teachers, we need to teach them about odds and logic and how to make decisions in the heat of a moment. And yet at the same time, you'll have ads saying, quick, gamble now, gamble now. So it's always undermining, but on the surface, appearing to inform and empower. I also think it's important, as you say, there's a lot of claims about effectiveness. It contrasts with what we know. For example, what the WHO promotes is needed to protect people from the harms of a lot of these products. What we know we need to do to deal with climate change, what the body of evidence says, what we need to do to protect children from firearms. But I think importantly as well, the WHO, for example, when we talk about alcohol best buys, for example, alcohol policy is raising support for those policies. And yet, particularly, teenagers, they're not being, given the full story of what's driving a lot of these issues or what's needed. And of course, some fascinating studies also show that what children learn, parents come to understand. So actually a lot of what's talked around around the table is parents, pick up what children learn at school as well. And so you inevitably reach parents through what you teach your children as well, and teachers as well. But there's so much to unpick here as well, because there's also the arguments over what counts as industry influence. So a lot of these assertions will be, we're independent of the industry who's funding us. They had no direct input into the contents of our material. We wrote this material before the industry came along. Now, there's a lot to unpick there, and probably too much for this one podcast. But I do think it's really important to think about the ways in which influence occurs, because by simply being funded, the industry is elevating certain materials over others. That's just inherently, you can get to more schools, You can have more appealing colors and images, the more money you have. So the flow of industry money will kind of determine how much then flows into schools. It's a knock-on effect. And I think the other thing to consider is, and we've sometimes done this, haven't we, Nathan? Kind of wanted to give people kind of key messages is, if you are absolutely committed to protecting children and young people, I think it's always questioned, if an industry is willing to fund something, you have to ask why. Because particularly when it comes to harmful industries, their interests are in complete conflict with children and young people. So if they're willing to fund it, there's a real big question mark. The other is that thinking about those policy substitutions and how the industry can use its funding to ultimately block what we know is needed to protect children and young people from harm. So I think it's understanding the limit of how much you can control what the industry is getting out of a particular arrangement, and the credibility. And we know that from the tobacco industry documents that they recognize the importance of funding and partnering with reputable organizations. So,
yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating. I find myself remembering these early campaigns from my own childhood, in I guess it would be the late 80s, early 90s in Northern Ireland. And, the Stop, Look, Listen campaigns were really popular. They had all these kind of, these campaigns for road safety for children, like Stop, Look, Listen, always remember, do these things before you cross the road. And I had a couple of near misses as a child where I was nearly hit by a car that was going very fast. And it was really fascinating because my first instinct in each of those situations was of guilt. Like, I must not have stopped, look, listened, rather than it being one of, how is a car traveling, how is such a large thing traveling so fast in such proximity to a school route or to, to a bunch of kids? And I think it points to the heavy lifting that these kind of campaigns, as you say, whether they're industry funded or not, but the ascendancy of those kind of campaigns can have. And you could totally see why policymakers talking to car manufacturers in the 80s and 90s might be saying, look, we're having a lot of issues with road traffic accidents near schools. Here's an armamentarium of solutions. And the industry going, well, I like the idea of that Stop, Look, Listen campaign because we can all get on board with that. There's partnership. We're all in agreement that we should do that. Whereas other things like reducing the speed limit to 20 in these kind of areas, right, or introducing more pedestrianized zones would just be an area where there would not be that same level of unanimity for the reasons you describe. I hope that listeners are getting a sense of both how powerful these interventions can be from an industry perspective, like how helpful they can be, and how important it is that we study them more. Because as you say, this is separate to direct marketing, which there is, I think, a lot more discourse around, and I think a lot more interest from organizations like WHO, thinking about marketing to children, thinking about the rights of children. But this is, I think, equally important. I don't know if you agree.
No, it's 100%, and I think it's really looking across all those levels and those elements as well, and understanding that the misinformation around the kind of overt harms and the evidence, whether that's on climate change, on the risks associated with alcohol use, not just misuse or heavy drinking, and all the different evidence on the types of cancers. We need to deal with the misinformation, but as you say, these kind of really powerful narratives around blaming of children, blaming of behaviors, peer pressure, and really that core message of individualism and personal responsibility, and very little effort or recognition to empower children and young people with understanding of basic kind of social determinants of health, or what is shaping their world, or what shapes their health. And I think there are two aspects to this that I think are particularly important, is that they are denying children and young people the possibility of a different future, of imagining different worlds, different policy regimes, different ways in which we can understand a problem. And I think that's really key, because I'm sure, and I hope many educators out there, because I'm not a teacher, and I know there are many out there who do this every day. To me, that is core to education. And I'm sure what most teachers get up in the morning is to instill this imagination and sense of possibility of how we can have a better world. And if you think about these these prescribed narratives around harms and what needs to be done about them, and just reproducing a status quo favorable to industry, really denies what I think is the core of education. There's another aspect that I think, just to add to all this, some great work done by different scholars looking at education and the kind of right to education and how people will learn. But for example, Katie Worth, who I really would promote her work, looking at, for years studied how children in the US are learning about climate changes. She highlights is a lot of this is an abuse of that trusted relationship between a teacher and their students. Because students trust, that's a space where learning is happening between a teacher and a student. And if you think about it, the industry is using that context and that relationship to get their message across. And I think that's a really important understanding. It's like kind of what we talk about with pharmaceutical industry influencing patient care. We have a lot of focus on influencing of doctors and prescribing, and that sanctity of that relationship between doctor and a patient, and how that shouldn't be influenced beyond anything but care for that patient. We have, I would say, a very similar situation between a teacher and the trust instilled into that relationship by students and young people. And so, I think that kind of understanding of, school as a safe space where you should be imagining and the possibility of, futures does, the influence from industry does need to be addressed there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose going back to the example of road traffic accidents, it's not just that you're placing a huge amount of individual responsibility on children, but you're almost removing the potential for them to think, like you say, to imagine, or to think about collective action, or to think about finding ways to shape the structures around them, or at least understanding which structures around them deserve to be remolded. You know what I mean? Instead of making this all about an individualistic narrative.
Absolutely. It's about teaching, a lot of what we see is about, well, we've got a status quo that we're unwilling to change and is harmful to youth. And so we're going in and saying, you have to figure out how to make yourself safe in a world that is ultimately unhealthy, unsafe, and unsustainable.
Rather than saying, here is the world as it is, here are the paths to changing it, or here are the things that you maybe might wish to be motivated by, or to work with others with. It's quite a thought, actually, to think about how we discharge that obligation towards children in terms of framing the world as one in which they have agency, but understanding what types of agency they have, and how their imagination could actually turn into action, and where they shouldn't be victimized or made to feel like they're uniquely responsible for harms that befall them, like you say, because of the environment around them. This has been a really fascinating conversation, May. I'm so glad that we were able to talk about this and about schools. And I hope that listeners are thinking about either things that they've come across in their own childhoods, things that they have heard from their children, things that perhaps they've come across as educators, where unnecessarily or deliberately we see the ascendancy of industry favorable arguments and the shaping and pollution of discourse in these really powerful ways. I did want to end with, if it's okay with you, May, with a question for early career researchers. But first to say that as a parent of 3 young boys, I am both a little bit terrified of just how influential the school environment is, and how I was amazed how quickly it was that the kids learned what Prime Energy was, the drink. And when I asked them what Prime Energy was, the older 2 straight away said, almost in unison, they said, "It's just what you drink if you're cool." That was like all they knew about Prime Energy. And so it just struck me on the one hand how influential these school environments are. But on the other hand, on a more hopeful side, I was also struck by how much they're able to take in and digest because of the scale of their imagination and the kind of openness with which they approach problems. And, when I was starting out in public health, I have to confess that I did bore my children and my partner a lot, regaling the public health basics, over dinner, and saying, "Can you believe the social determinants of health inequalities, and then commercial determinant?" And at that time I wasn't really talking about commercial determinants, but I was doing work on how the alcohol industry uses responsible drinking narratives. That was like my MSc dissertation. And so I remember speaking to the kids and to Shireen, my partner, a lot about that, and at the dinner table, and saying, "Isn't it so fast?" And of course you would think that completely goes over the kids' heads, but I do remember overhearing Charlie talking with another kid, and they were talking about what their parents did. And I overheard Charlie, the kid, ask, "What does your daddy do?" And Charlie just said, "Oh, my dad catches people who lie for money." And I thought that was so fascinating, because that is not at all how I would frame this kind of work. But in a very visceral way, I guess that is part of what we're doing. That's part of what you're doing here, is you're catching people who are reframing for money.
100%. I mean, I need that on a T-shirt. Actually, I love those. I love that way it's discussed. I should have it on a business card. I think that would be, if I had one. Not very organized in that way, but I do, and I think that's the point. Is that there, one thing you're kind of describing there is that that even the word catching, it's not so much that, but what we are doing is shining a light on where all this comes from and
Yes.
why it's happening, and kind of coming back to what I was saying at the beginning is, it's I suppose it's a lifetime quest of just asking why. These things are not inevitable. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think Darren Powell, for example, who's done fantastic work, really unpicking and documenting and explaining what's going on in schools, done some fantastic ethnographic work in New Zealand, looking particularly at, as you were saying, Nathan, this focus on physical activity, and nothing wrong with teaching physical activity. But when it's promoted by industries who are doing everything they can to shape the food environment driving obesity, then we need to say, wait a minute, what's going on? And he makes the point, if you're going to take this industry materials, often which is industry funded materials, free, use it to, as flip them on their head, teach children why the industry is doing it and the role of industry in shaping it, and kind of what we call like culture jamming. So there's never, children are exceptionally astute at kind of seeing what's going on once they're given the opportunity to do so. I think it's just about empowering teachers and schools and kind of wider community to understand and feel comfortable in doing so. School curricula is obviously a huge issue beyond this one episode, and it's not for us to sit here and say what schools can do and not do. But I do think we need to say, but while people could push back on that, you say, okay, but you're happy with the industries to continue to go in and do exactly what you said we can't do. So, it's who is shaping all this and why. And as you say, I think, just the inevitability of this is the drink, this is cool, is you can see already this narrative of industries like tobacco well versed at exploiting concepts like cool and imagery, and just resurfacing all of this and giving children back and young people the spaces where they can kind of unpick and consider all these different aspects of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really fascinating, May. Thank you again so much for taking the time to speak to us.
I could speak all day. Thank
you. So if you have time, I just wanted to ask one more question. Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, fantastic. So as always, I like to end these conversations with a question geared more towards those just starting out in their careers. They could be early career researchers or students or people contemplating a career change or anything like that. And I thought the question I would like to ask you is, well, when I think about the work that you've done and the why questions that you've been asking, it strikes me that those are sometimes uncomfortable questions to ask, especially when they may challenge assumed values or norms or parameters of success, right? So there are people involved in delivering these school-based education programs. There are organizations involved in delivering them. In public health organizations and authorities, there are people involved in health promotion campaigns that echo industry narratives. There are researchers involved in the kind of so-called evaluation of these materials. So it isn't just an academic exercise, I suppose. There is an element of potential conflict and discomfort, and especially when you're an early career person, you want to ask these questions, but there is often the opportunity that, as Rebecca Cassidy said in her episode, that you may run into these difficult situations where you're in rooms that are adversarial, or you're in situations that are challenging. I just wanted to ask if you had any reflections or advice for early career folks based on your own experience of doing these types of research, navigating these different spaces, and just kind of any reflections at all to help them on their way.
Thank you, Nathan. And they're really, really important questions. I have to confess, I'm very much still an early career researcher myself, really, and I'm learning, how challenging asking why questions are, and I think that's a really important question. A lot of the early research and types of research that I was doing asked what is going on, and we'd measure and we'd kind of much more, I suppose it's biomedical research is a very different space. And so when you start to come out into, public health and particularly commercial determinants of health, you are asking a lot more about why we're doing things and why it's not another way. And these are very different questions, I think. And particularly, as you say, is that you come up against, people who either are benefiting from the status quo or are working in a system where what we're doing is presented as the way of doing things. And so what we're doing is sometimes we're resurfacing things that are taken completely for granted and taken as the way to keep people, to keep children and young people safe. And for many, have just never really, either had the opportunity to question, or we're just not in a space at the moment where we are questioning it. And I always think something that I think is key is that it is difficult and it is overwhelming to ask why we're doing things a particular way, particularly when it's embedded and normal. And so many, as you say, so many people are involved in it. But I think at the same time, if something's a bit challenging, a bit difficult to do, and if something has become so normalized that it's almost out of reach or not to be questioned, then it's probably worth doing. Because if you think about it, if something becomes so unchallengeable, that means that it can be causing harm and we can't question it. So, it's resurfacing some of these things are really important, because it's saying, but why are we doing this, and who's benefiting? And it's so important to keep that at a kind of, thinking about how we've established systems and structures and ways of thinking that are driving this. It's not to question, particular individuals or, sometimes even organizations, but we do need to say, but how are these systems and ideas and ways of doing things become so entrenched that we can't even see that, children and young people's benefits are not being prioritized here. So actually sometimes being the one who says, well, maybe we can revisit this. It is tough, but it's opening up spaces for further questions and debate, and to say, look, how do we get children and young people's health and interests front and center again, get them there where they haven't traditionally been. And I also think there's something about when you're doing this, though, or even in any research, I do think what's key, and that I've really feel so lucky to have been supported to do so from an incredible best friend and soulmate, my partner Don, and colleagues like yourself and Mark and Rebecca and others who've kind of supported me along the way, is that it's not easy, but it's important to be asking questions like this, and that one of the things is that reflecting on your own thinking. So having people around you who kind of give you the confidence. I'm not explaining myself properly, but what I'm trying to say is that give you the confidence to step back and not just ask questions of others or systems and ideas, but say, gosh, maybe the way I've been thinking for the last few years, or even my whole life, has been shaped by these wider forces that we're studying ourselves. So I think one of the most important things I've ever done along the way is say, well, why was I thinking a certain way? Why did I think this was the answer? Why did I not think about these questions before? And so I think it's about being as critical of yourself and your own assumptions as it is of that kind of wider system ideas and norms. Because sometimes your own thinking, you're coming in with ideas and systems and ideas and norms that have come from those very systems that need to be questioned. So I think it's reflecting on your own assumptions and ideas. I do think there is also something really key here. Well, there's two aspects: is learning from others and learning from other fields. The kind of boundaries that we have at the moment between public health and political science and history, these borders are, well, they're kind of historical and socially constructed as well. So not being afraid to let that kind of knowledge spill across borders is fantastic. Really so much of what we understand in schools and influence influence on schools from industry come from historians. Naomi Resky and Eric Conway in their latest book show how important education and film and public education and youth, they describe that so well in their historical account of industry kind of influence on the way we think, particularly in the US. And so really being able to learn from other areas and other specialties is absolutely key, and questioning those boundaries. Then I'll end by saying the other thing is we tend to think of ourselves or our work or like how are we going to change things. And I think it's important to remember people will change things. Make sure your ideas, your research actually is empowers others. And I think particularly of the amazing work in Ireland from the Community Action Group of Paula Leonard and many others, is that, it's at the end of the day, you people need to be empowered to take the research and change the world in the way that they want to. You need to be reaching out to the people who actually are on the ground and doing and changing things, and empowering them to think about how they want to use that to change it. Your paper is just one step, or your research is one step along that wider journey to change. So it might feel like nothing's happening, but that's because it's part of just a much bigger story.
What a note to end on. May, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you, Nathan. It's an absolute pleasure. And I really look forward to hearing the next episode and see where this podcast takes the field of commercial determinants.
Well, that's it for another episode of Money Power Health. Huge thanks to Dr. May van Schalkwyk for joining us to discuss her important work. I'll leave some links in the show notes if you want to read more about some of her papers. May also has a special interest in the use of film for public health advocacy and policy change, so I'll also link to some videos she has produced about some of this research in case you want to check those out or share them further. Thank you so much for listening, sharing and engaging. It is wonderful to be back doing Money Power Health again. I'll leave Charlie to read us out and see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving a rating. It helps other people find it. The music in this podcast was by Daniel Manny. You can find more information about his music in the show notes. This announcement was read by the very talented Charlie Manny.